We're going to look back into 2 Kings. We'll probably read a lot this morning, a lot of the verses, a lot of the scripture for this. And I know we're going to be looking at 2 Kings. So we're going to start in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 1. I was telling Luke, I guess if we title the lesson, this portion would be Jehu is anointed and the death of Elisha. And that will end the lesson. There's some stuff that happens in between, of course. But we look at these lessons, and I've said this, it's like small short stories. It's just little snippets, little snapshots of the life of Elijah, the life of Elijah, the life of the nation of Israel, the kings of Judah, these kings. And it's a continuation, was the way I was thinking. When you look at it, it's really, that's what it is. It's a continuation. It's not that Elisha began a new work. It's that he continued the work of Elijah. And we can look at that, and I think really that's the way the natural course it should be, even within the church. It's we look back. We had our 245th homecoming last week, and you think about that. I'm pretty sure the church has stayed on some pretty solid cardinal doctrines to have stayed in place. So those, you look at the list of pastors and then the list of officers and the list of members in the church, and it's been a continuation. Is what I'm trying to say. It's not that we began a new work, but we continue the work that God had laid out. So His work doesn't change. It's just that He might be glorified. And that's part of our work, and that's what Elijah did. He did the work, and he was used of God in a way that was pleasing to Him. And it had to be. It was not easy work. It had to be scary work at times. Elijah. We know that he had times that he was concerned. My dad used to say, "Well, I don't worry, but I'm concerned." I think as he got older, I sensed he worried about things. So I think there was times that he was concerned, and I know there's times that Elisha was concerned in his ministry, that he continued, that he picked up and continued on from Elijah. So that's kind of what we do. Does that make sense? That's kind of what we do within the church. I'm not here to bring anything new. I'm here to continue something. And there'll be, if time goes on, there'll be somebody else that stands up here and teaches this Sunday school class. And there'll be somebody that teaches the other classes. There'll be another pastor. There'll be other deacons. And that's what we want. We want the work to continue on. I don't know. I know we've been saying it for years, but we're just that much closer. But the Lord I believe He's soon coming. He could come at any time. There's nothing left to take place to prevent the Lord from taking His bride, from taking the church. And that's a wonderful reality, but it's also a very thought-provoking reality when you realize if you have lost people, if you have lost family members, if you have lost friends, if you have lost acquaintances, when that takes place and they have heard the gospel and they have rejected it, my understanding is they have sealed, they have made that decision. That's a sad thing. So we want to come, we say, Lord, come quickly, but He's long-suffering. So that was kind of my rabbit chase, I guess, for this morning. But we're going to go into 2 Kings chapter 9. We looked in the last lesson how, I think it was Hazael took the place of Ben-Hadad, the king there, killed him, assassinated him. So we see a lot of the things that God has His hand in who is ruling, who's the head of a nation. And I believe He still does that. He allows people, and sometimes He doesn't allow who we think, but God has His purposes. If you look at the list, I should have copied it. Maybe I will. But J. Vernon McGee has made a chronological list of all the kings of Israel, the nation of Israel. I remember it's just several. It's several kings from the first king, from Saul, all the way to the last king. And he'll list their reign, their years, and whether they were considered a good king based on what God said about them, or they were a bad king. There was only about maybe 6 kings that it was, you could say that they were good kings. And we're talking probably close to 50. I don't know. It's a guesstimate number that I can recall, but it was a bunch. So the percentage of what God would say was good kings was a very low number. But yet God would use those people to do his work, to do his will. So it's not, we'll look at a situation that, well, that don't make sense. Why would he allow that? But yet we find out if we're sometimes just patient enough, we'll see God's hand, how things play out. Sometimes he can take evil things and he can cause a nation. He can bring a nation to their knees, but he can bring, I believe, a sense of revival to a people. Because who do we call out to when we face hard times? When we hit rock bottom, and it's sad that we had to get there, but we call out to God, don't we? And sometimes God has to let us hit rock bottom to get our attention. And I don't ever wish for that, but that's what happens sometimes. But we look in 2 Kings chapter 9, and I said I'm going to read a lot of scripture, but we're going to be looking at Jehu. He's going to be anointed king. We won't look so much about his reign. He was not one of the kings that was in the list as a good king, but still yet God used him to get his plan played out, and we'll see that as we go through this lesson. So he's going to be anointed as king, and then we'll look the first section. We'll see some more of Elisha, or Elijah's, I should say, unfinished business that is going to be continued by Elisha. So 2 Kings 9:1, it says, "And Elisha the prophet called one of the children of the prophets and said unto him," so here's a young student, you might say, a young prophet, and he's going to give him instructions to do something. Does he understand what he's doing? Maybe not, but he's going to follow through. He's going to be obedient and do what's asked of him. He says, "Gird up thy loins and take this box of oil in thine hand and go to Ramoth Gilead. And when thou comest thither, look out there Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat." So he knows specifically who he's looking for. He's the son of Nimshi. "And go in and make him arise up from among his brethren and carry him to an inner chamber." So he wants this to be a private matter, and God has his reasons for having it done this way, and we will see that. But it says, "Then take the box of oil and pour it on his head and say, Thus saith the Lord, I have anointed thee king over Israel." And that's a very important statement, because it wasn't that many kings that God intervened, in a sense, and personally saw to it that the kings were anointed, that somebody took the time to anoint them with oil. So this lets us know, I think, that God was definitely involved in this change in the leadership that we're going to see here. So it says, "Thus saith the Lord, I have anointed thee king over Israel." He says, "Then open the door and flee and tarry out." So there's a reason he's doing this, and the reason is secrecy. He doesn't want word to get to Joram of what's taking place, because he's the one that's going to be deposed. He's the king that's in place, and we'll see where he's at. It says, "So the young man, even the young man the prophet, went to Ramoth Gilead, and when he came, behold, the captains of the host were sitting, and he said, I have an errand to thee, O captain. And Jehu said, Unto which of all us? And he said, To thee, O captain." So it's very specific. "And he arose and went into the house, and he poured the oil on his head, and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I have anointed thee king over the people of the Lord." So a very, very special position that he is being anointed for. But he's anointed thee king over the people of the Lord, even over Israel. But now he's going to tell him his mission. I think this is part of the reason for the kind of secrecy, but he's going to repeat what he's told, but he wants him to be the first one to hear it. He says, "And thou," speaking to Jehu, "and thou shalt smite the house of Ahab thy master." So we knew that this was going to happen, didn't we? We know that Ahab he's already dead, but his lineage, his dynasty is going to be cut off. So he's letting Jehu know that you're going to have a part in that. You may not be one of the good kings, but you're going to be used. And he doesn't know what he's going to do, what he's going to be involved in. But he says, and thou shalt smite the house of Ahab thy master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord at the hand of Jezebel. And I'll just go ahead and jump ahead of myself. But who can you think of? Who was it that Ahab and Jezebel, they had killed because of a piece of land? Who was it? The vineyard. I know these Bible names are just so, they just roll off your tongue. Was it? Starts with an N. Naboth. Remember Naboth? You know, we thought, well, Naboth, he was abused and used and forgot about. But no, God didn't forget about him. And God is going to avenge his death. You know, the Lord says, the vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And so sometimes it's just a matter of waiting on the Lord. So Ahab's dynasty, as prophesied, is going to meet its end, as promised. And that means that the lineage is going to stop. There won't be a successor to him. And so when God stops something, he stops it, doesn't he? Completely. He ends it. He doesn't leave any loose ends. So Ahab's dynasty meets its end as has been prophesied. Then we look in verse 7 again. He says, just to repeat what we just read, but it says, and thou shalt smite the house of Ahab, thy master. So that's talking about the household, his bloodline, that I may avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord at the hand of Jezebel. So they were a team, weren't they? Ahab and Jezebel. They're a very evil team. So here this promise is going to come to pass. So God intended to use Jehu as a tool of judgment against the royal house of Ahab. And as I said, you know, God uses those he chooses, even though we don't always understand what he's doing. And those around him, you know, who is this crazy man that's come in here and what's he talking about? In verse 12, those that were there with Jehu, they say, and they said, it is false. He says, tell us now. And he said, thus and thus spake he to me, saying, thus saith the Lord, I have anointed thee king over Israel. And, you know, from my notes, I put down, well, there's no question. You know, God has anointed this. God has made this decision. So if they wanted to argue, well, they had to argue with God, didn't they? And so I think that was enough. That answered their question, because we see in verse 13, then they hasted and took every man his garment and put it under him on the top of the stairs and blew the trumpet, saying, Jehu is king. So they in a sense, they were swearing their allegiance to the newly anointed king Jehu. But Jehoram, or Joram, as you read these names, they're kind of hard to keep up with sometimes, because one place it'll be used as Joram, but the proper will be Jehoram. There's a Joash and there's a Joash, so it's kind of hard to keep them straight, or is for me anyhow. But Joram is to be deposed as Israel's king, along with Judah's king. So the tribes were split, along with Ahaziah, Judah's king. So the king of Israel and the king of Judah. And it says in verse 15, but King Joram was returned. So he had been in battle with the Syrians. And it says he was returned to be healed. He had been wounded in battle, healed in Jezreel of the wounds which the Syrians had given him when he fought with Hazael, king of Syria. And Jehu said, now here's what the secret. He says, if it be your minds, let none go forth nor escape out of the city to go tell it in Jezreel. So he didn't want Joram to know what was taking place. He wanted to be able to be there on scene to finish this, as we'll see, to finish Joram also, to have him removed from the position of king. So he didn't want anybody going ahead and sharing the news. So it says, so Jehu rode in a chariot and went to Jezreel. And apparently, if you read the whole thing, it talks about how there were some watchmen and they saw him coming. And they said, well, who is this? Well, they said he drives like Jehu. So he must have been a crazy driver in his chariot. You know, I thought, well, we've got that today. You know, I used to be one of them crazy drivers. You know, yeah, gives you something with a little speed, a little power. He had a lot of horsepower, I guess, didn't he? If he had a chariot. But that was what was said of him. But he wanted to get there before Joram was aware of what was taking place. So he rode in a chariot and went to Jezreel, for Joram lay there. And Ahaziah, king of Judah, was come down to see him. So God has worked it out to where both that are going to be removed are in the same place. So, you know, God, he works things out. He allows things to take place. He knows when things are going to take place. It says in verse 21, and Joram said, make ready. So he realizes he sent out 3 to ask the question, do you come in peace? And Jehu more or less lets them know, we're not coming in peace. He says, follow in behind me. And so they do. They follow in behind. They become a part of the group that's going in. So he realizes that this is not a peaceful group that's coming towards him there in Jezreel. And Joram said, he says, make ready. And his chariot was ready. And Joram, king, he though he's wounded, and Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, went out, each in his chariot, and they went out against Jehu. So they were going to go into battle against him. And met him in the portion, no, this is important, met him in the portion of Naboth the Jezreelite. So here they are, they're within the property, the boundaries of the property that Naboth, the one that had been killed, that he owned. So this brings to truth, you know, what had been prophesied. In verse 22, and it came to pass when Joram saw Jehu that he said, is it peace, Jehu? And he answered, what peace? So long as the whoredoms of thy mother, Jezebel, and her witchcrafts are so many. So no, in short, it was not peace. He was not coming for peace. He was coming to end a reign that had been told. That was his mission. And Joram turned his hands. He realizes this is definitely not a peaceful meeting. And Joram turned his hands and fled, and said to Ahaziah, he says, there is treachery, O Ahaziah. And Jehu drew a bow with his full strength and smote Joram between his arms, and the arrow went out at his heart, and he sunk down in his chariot. You know, just as the young man drew his bow at a chance there with Ahab, but yet it hit its mark, didn't it? And I think it's a picture of the same thing here, that Jehu drew his bow with his full strength, and it hit its mark. And maybe God was guiding that mark. But the end that was wanted happened. So he sunk down in his chariot. Then said Jehu to Bidkar, his captain, take up and cast him in the portion of the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. So that's where his dead body is going to be put. He says, for remember how that when I and thou rode together after Ahab his father, the Lord laid this burden upon him. He says, surely I have seen yesterday the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, saith the Lord, and I will require thee in this plat. I will requite thee in this plat, saith the Lord. Now therefore take and cast him into the plat of ground according to the word of the Lord. So God ordained it, and it happened, didn't it? You know, we think, well, we can get around things, or people think they can do evil and get beyond it. But you know, we can always rest assured that as what we sow, we'll reap. And so it's a good idea to always try to sow good seed, isn't it, in our lives? It's scary. It's always been a scary thought to me. You think back, well, you know, what kind of seeds have I sown in my life? You know, what's going to come up? When will it come up? You know, thank the Lord, He's merciful. I believe He's the one that sometimes He can quash those seeds in our lives. But we can be assured that God will avenge those of His that are wrong. And that's what He's done here. So Naboth has been avenged. But now there's one more that remains that has to be dealt with. And that's Joram's mother. That's Jezebel, isn't it? That she has to be dealt with. And we look in chapter 9, verse 30. We'll look there. But it says, and when Jehu was come to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it. So this has been a while. But she's heard the news that Jehu is coming. And I think she's still, I don't know, vain is one word you could use for her, but she's still very prideful. I think she still feels that she's queen. She feels as if she's untouchable. There's nobody going to harm her. She's the queen. And I think that's her attitude when he arrives, and we'll see that. But she heard it, and she painted her face. Now, I don't know, you all, I don't think this is a bad term, but I would hear my grandmother, she'd say this, don't take this wrong, but if you'd see a young girl or a young woman, just a bunch of makeup on, and so she says she's caked her face up like a Jezebel. She's painted up like a Jezebel. Y'all heard that? Now, I don't think that's a derogatory thing, but that was just something that I've heard her say. And when I read this, and it says, and she painted her face, I thought of my grandmother Moss telling us that as kids. So just interesting how Scripture, how people will take things and apply them, I guess. But it says, and she painted her face, and she tired her head, and she looked out of the window. She had just, her vanity, she had more or less dressed up. She wanted to be presentable because she had no idea, really, I don't think, of what was going to take place. And she's going to show her disdain for the one who is coming, Jehu. In verse 31, she says there, where it says there, and as Jehu entered at the gate, she said, now she brings up something from the past. And she says, had Zimri peace, who slew his master? And she's making a reference here. And she calls Jehu Zimri, and this was after the man who assassinated King Baasha of Israel. And Zimri was also a servant to his king Baasha. He was a commander in his army. And really what it was doing, it was her way of calling Jehu just a despicable rebel. Because apparently Zimri didn't meet a good end. He was caught and he was put to death. But it was really, in a sense, it was an implied threat to him. So again, she has no idea what's about to take place. She was still just in defiance. Maybe that's the word. She was still in defiance against what was right. So it says in verse 32, Jehu, it says, and he lifted up his face to the window and said, who is on my side? And it says, and there looked out to him 2 or 3 eunuchs. I can't help but think, as mean and evil as she was, that even those around her, yes, they were subject to her, but probably wasn't that many of them that liked her. And they were thinking, what an opportunity we may have here to get rid of her. Y'all remember the Wizard of Oz? And what they threw the water on the old witch, and Dorothy thought, oh, they're going to be mad. No, they were glad. That's a little bit of a picture, I think, of what was happening here. They had been waiting, man, somebody deliver us from this evil woman. And that's what's going to take place. And he said, or Jehu, then he said, throw her down. And what did they do? It says, so they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses, and he trode her underfoot. And if there was any greater disrespect that you could have shown royalty, here it is. And he showed her complete and utter disdain, disrespect for her, that she was deserving of this death that she suffered for all that she had done. he trod her underfoot of the horse. So she was killed. And in verse 34, that kind of lets us know that it didn't really affect him. He wasn't bothered by it. It says, and when he was come in, he did eat and drink. So he went on about his business and said, go see now to this cursed woman, and bury her, for she is a king's daughter. So they're going to give her a burial. And they went to bury her, but notice what it says. But they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. Wherefore they came again and told him, and he said, this is the word of the Lord, which he spake by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, in the portion of Jezreel shall dogs eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the carcass of Jezebel shall be as dung upon the face of the field in the portion of Jezreel, so that they shall not say, this is Jezebel. So they didn't even have enough remains to really give even a burial. And so her memory was to even be removed. That's how God felt about this. So Jezebel, if you look at the timeline, it talks about she died about 14 years after Ahab was killed. And that made me think of something Brother Larry had said to me. I don't know if I remember the quote correctly, but I tried to find it. But I think it goes, justice rides a slow horse, but he always arrives. Is that pretty close? And that's true, isn't it? Justice rides a slow horse, but always arrives. And even 14 years later, she may have thought, I've gotten away with this, but she had not gotten away with it, had she? So the last portion of our lesson, we'll read this, and I think we'll have just enough time, but is the death of Elisha. It says in chapter 13 of 2 Kings, verse 14, it says, now Elisha was fallen sick of his sickness whereof he died. And God, one writer talks about, probably God decided what that sickness would be. Elisha may have thought, well, maybe I'll be carried out in chariots of fire as Elijah was. But God chose him to have an earthly death. That was God's way of dealing with him. Sick of the illness whereof he died, and Joash, the king of Israel, came down unto him and wept over his face. Joash was considered to be one of the good kings, and said, O my father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof. Same words that were spoken over Elijah. So Joash, he knew that the loss of Elisha, it was going to be a national loss. He had prophesied for about 60 years. He was some generations, that's all they knew. But he knew that God had used him. But it says in verse 20, and Elisha died, and they buried him, and the bands of the Moabites invaded the land at the ending of the year. And it came to pass, as they were burying a man, that behold, they spied a band of men, and they cast the man into the sepulchre of Elisha. So they threw him into that grave, lowered him into this grave. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood upon his feet. He came back alive. So I thought, well, as I read that, I thought, well, if you believe the axe head floated, then we can believe this too, can't we? And he did, and he was revived. He was brought back to life. He stood upon his feet, there in verse 21. So when the dead man's body touched Elisha's bones, it's talking about how there was such power that the dead man revived and stood on his feet. And one of the writers says that we could say this was Elisha's last miracle. But I like what it says. It's in the lesson it talked about. It said this is one of the more strange and unusual miracles in the Bible. There's little explanation, and the silence of the record suggests that there was not inherent. This is very important. There was not inherent power in the bones of Elisha to resuscitate others, and this seems to be a unique one-time miracle to bring honor to the memory of this great prophet. And this is very important. And I put in there my notes this is not grounds for the belief of miraculous workings of relics. There's the church that takes the bones and parts of the saints and things and these relics, and they believe they have power. And that's idolatry, is what that is. So I would agree that it wasn't anything special that somebody could have took a bone, one of Elisha's bones, and used it hid it away somewhere. That's not what God is saying here, but he's using an example, I think, if nothing else, to memorialize how he was used. So again, it's not grounds for the use of relics and idolatry. And the writer, he said, would that our lives have such an influence for God's glory. The memory of a deceased godly father, mother, or loved one has caused many a wayward person to seek the Lord. I found a quote by Charles Spurgeon. He said, "Dear friends, let us seek to live that even ungodly men may miss us when we are gone." And I thought that'd be a good testimony, wouldn't it? That even the lost would look for us and wonder about us when we're gone. And I know we've had some events here in the last month or so. I think people have lived a life that have left that we missed them, but God had his purposes. All right. So Lord willing, we'll go into lesson 12 next week. Thank you all.
Thank you.